She didn't come with bodyguards or microphones, just a faded scarf, worn sandals, and a yellow folder clutched tight against her chest. Aicha Dembele, a retired schoolteacher from a forgotten village, walked into a five-star hotel lobby in Burkina Faso, where Western executives sipped champagne and signed billion-dollar mining deals. She didn't belong there, at least not according to them. But in her hands was the truth, decades of silence, theft, and betrayal wrapped in wax cloth. And standing beside her, a man in a red beret, who wasn't just a president, he was a reckoning. What if your country had been robbed of $60 billion no one told you? What if foreign CEOs grew rich while your children dug through poisoned soil? And what if justice came not with tanks but with a teacher, a folder, and a single sentence that shattered everything? This isn't fiction, this is Burkina Faso. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. If you believe that stories of truth and dignity still matter, subscribe now and tell us where in the world you're listening from. The morning began like any other in the quiet village of Saponet. The red dust hung low in the air, clinging to cassava leaves and schoolhouse windows. Children's laughter echoed behind a small garden where Aicha Dembele knelt beside rows of young stems, her hands guiding them into the soil. At 64, Aicha had spent more than 4 decades teaching arithmetic and French, but the land, she often said, taught her more than books ever could. That day, a motorbike approached from the horizon, kicking up a cloud of dust. A boy shouted, "Madame Aicha, a man from the city!" She stood, brushed her palms, and squinted into the light. The rider wasn't from the city, at least not anymore. He wore an old uniform patched at the shoulders, identical to the one her late brother once wore. Her heart skipped. He handed her a sealed envelope. "Your brother asked me to give you this, before he passed." No ceremony, no explanation, just a quiet delivery from a man who carried something heavier than he showed. Inside her modest clay house, Aicha opened the package by kerosene light. It was more than a letter, it was a folder. Hand-sewn, wrapped in wax cloth, it smelled faintly of oil and copper. Inside, she found handwritten notes, maps, official seals, and numbers, so many numbers. Her brother, Aicha Dembele, had been a mine inspector, honest to the bone, too honest. Before he disappeared the year prior, he told her in hushed tones over a crackly phone line, "They're not just digging gold, Aicha. They're digging graves for our future." Now she saw what he meant. One map showed abandoned mines in the north linked by tunnels to shipping depots in the capital. Another note listed bank accounts in Luxembourg and the British Virgin Islands. There were signatures, contracts, shipment logs marked for internal eyes only. At the bottom of the final page was a single sentence. "If I disappear, you'll know why and who to trust. Give this to the man in the red beret, the one who listens when others shout." There was only one man in Burkina Faso who fit that description, President Ibrahim Traore. Aicha stared at the documents for hours, her fingers trembling. She wasn't a lawyer, a soldier, or a politician. She was a teacher, a widow, a sister. But she knew when silence had run its course. At dawn, the next day, she dressed in her most modest wrap, the one she wore to her husband's funeral. She folded the documents carefully into a small leather satchel and tied another layer of cloth around it. Then, without fanfare, she walked through the school garden, pausing before each plant like whispering a promise. An old taxi stopped at the village edge. The driver didn't ask where she was going. He just opened the door. She didn't say goodbye. She wasn't leaving behind her village. She was carrying it with her. By nightfall, the red earth of Saponet disappeared behind her. In her lap, the yellow folder sat quietly holding the weight of a nation's stolen wealth, its silenced history, its forgotten dignity. Back in the capital, a storm had not yet broken, but clouds were gathering. President Ibrahim Traore, recently risen to power through defiant reform, was no stranger to whispers of corruption. He had seen how his country had been carved up by polite diplomats and clever lawyers, but now he held the truth in his hands. Inside the presidential compound, 3 key advisors sat across a long mahogany table: Captain Umar Diarra, Judge Aminata Coulibaly, and economic advisor Idris Nabayogo. All had received late-night calls with no explanation. They came because when Traore called, it wasn't for show. The folder lay at the center of the table. "These documents," Traore began quietly, "came from a teacher in Saponet. Her brother died getting them to us." Umar, sharp-eyed and unpolished, leaned forward. "Is this what we feared?" Traore didn't answer. He simply opened the folder. There were contracts with forged seals from the colonial era, claiming mining rights that had technically expired decades ago. There were freight manifests showing tons of gold exported under humanitarian labels, aid shipments that never carried medicine, only mineral wealth. Judge Aminata held one paper to the light. The signature. "It's not legal. The official was already dismissed when this was signed." She pointed to another. This seal, it's a copy of a 1950s French mining decree. Idris adjusted his glasses, staring at a ledger. These companies, they created dummy corporations in offshore tax shelters. For every ton of gold, less than 1% entered our national books. Umar stood up. We can shut them down. If the smuggling routes match these documents... Aminata raised a hand. Not yet. If we act without legal ground, they'll cry foul. Accuse us of violating trade laws. We need strategy. Traoré walked to the window. Below, children played near the fountain. Their laughter drifted faintly. They didn't come with tanks, he said. They came with pens, and we signed away our future. He turned to them. They didn't just steal our gold. They stole our dignity and convinced us to beg for crumbs. The room fell silent. Then Traoré pointed to a specific document, a cornerstone agreement signed in 1994, giving full mining control to a European consortium, the signatory a former official convicted of embezzlement before the ink had dried. If we void this one, Traoré said, every contract that followed collapses. Aminata's eyes lit up. It's enough, I can build a case. To the African Union Court, Traoré added, not the media, not yet. He turned to Umar, quietly gather customs records, prove the smuggling. To Idris, calculate the true cost, not just the gold, but poisoned water, lost labor, stolen generations. They all nodded. This is not revenge, Traoré said finally. This is repair. For every elder who died poor while their village sat on gold. For every child who never saw a classroom because a foreign CEO needed a new yacht. The rain began outside, quiet at first, then steady. Inside that room, a revolution had begun, not with fire or slogans, but with paper, silence, and truth. The Horizon Continental Hotel was not used to disruption. Its marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and imported orchids from Paris usually played host to calm negotiations and sanitized press releases. But that morning, as Western CEOs gathered in the grand lobby for what they thought would be a routine mining summit, something shifted. The air buzzed nervous, electric. And then the doors opened. Aicha Dembele stepped in first, wrapped in orange and blue wax cloth, her yellow folder pressed tightly to her chest. Behind her were 4 soldiers in camouflage, but they didn't need to move. The weight of her presence alone held the room still. A tall European man in a navy suit turned, his voice sharp. You don't belong here. This is for shareholders, real decision makers. She said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was more powerful than noise. Then another presence entered, quiet but unmistakable. President Ibrahim Traore. He didn't arrive with a speech. No entourage, no red carpet. He simply stepped into the room and it changed. The same CEO turned, trying to regain control. This is a private session, Mr. President. You weren't invited. Traoré didn't flinch. This is my country, and this room was built with what you stole. He nodded to Aicha. She stepped forward, opened the yellow folder, and held up a single document. Stamped in red letters across the top, revoked. Gasps rippled through the room. Journalists raised cameras. Security stiffened. Every ounce of gold, Traoré said. Every drop pulled from our soil under false contracts ends today. The CEO stammered, you can't just cancel 30 years of investment overnight. Traoré stepped closer. You call it investment. I call it theft. You're not being canceled. You're being corrected. The CEOs looked around. Phones buzzed. Executives murmured. What they had come to celebrate profit partnership control was slipping through their fingers. Your economy depends on us, one of them warned. Traoré looked him in the eye, calm, resolute. No, your economy depends on us, but we are no longer for sale. He turned away. The soldiers followed. Aicha followed, and silence filled the lobby like fog. Somewhere in the corner, a voice whispered, did he just take everything back? Yes, but what no one knew was just how prepared he had been. Within hours, the ripple reached embassies and boardrooms across the globe. The first response came quietly from Washington. An attaché from the U.S. Embassy arrived in a black SUV, requesting a friendly discussion. Inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he offered infrastructure support, military aid, and a discreet cash grant called a stabilization fund. Tucked within the folder he slid across the table were outlines for new trade arrangements on paper, generous. A senior aide looked at the folder, closed it gently, and said, tell your people we're not for sale, not anymore. Later that day, the French envoy arrived this time not with smiles but with fury. She barged into the Ministry of Commerce, demanded an emergency meeting, and declared, this is not how civilized nations behave. If President Traore does not reverse his actions, we will suspend all trade, freeze credit lines, and lock Burkina Faso out of our financial systems. The minister stared back calmly. Your companies have stolen more than trade. You should be grateful we're using words instead of force. By the next morning, the pressure intensified. Global banks began freezing transactions. The IMF issued a concern advisory. European newspapers branded Traoré a populist authoritarian. Headlines read, Burkina Faso risks instability. West Africa's fragile future under fire. Inside the presidential compound, the mood was tense. Ministers argued, advisors whispered about fuel shortages, some suggested pausing the audit until tensions cool. But Traoré was unmoved. Let them threaten, he said at a midnight cabinet meeting. We will not back down. Still, the weight of international punishment was real. Medical imports stalled, fuel shipments delayed. In the capital, prices began creeping upward. Fear crept in. But in the countryside, something else was happening. Aicha Dembele had returned to Sapanet. Word had reached her village. The president had exposed foreign companies, revoked mining contracts, and refused aid from the West. Some villagers were afraid. Would there be hunger? Would they be punished? Aicha stood beneath the neem tree in the center of the square, surrounded by women with cracked feet, farmers with dusty hands, children with empty bowls. They say we'll starve, she told them. They say if we don't bow, we won't eat. She raised her voice. Then let them starve us. We've lived from this land before. We'll do it again. We are not their pets. We are the soil, and the soil remembers. One elder clapped, then another. A boy raised his fist. Foro, freedom. The chant spread. No microphones, no speeches, just resolve. Back in the capital, Traoré received a handwritten note from Sapanet. We stand, even if hungry. He folded it gently, placed it beside the growing stack of threats from Europe. Judge Aminata Coulibaly entered. Should we issue a public response? He nodded. Yes, but not with words, with action. That same evening, he appeared on state television. No theatrics, just truth. We are not anti-West, we are anti-theft. We welcome partners, but not masters. We will trade, but not at gunpoint. The message reverberated across the continent. In Tanzania, ministers debated their own mining contracts. In Senegal, students marched holding signs that read, "We are not poor, we were robbed." Burkina Faso had drawn a line, not with violence, not with tanks, but with a folder, a signature, and a president who refused to blink. And across the red earth of West Africa, an old truth returned with quiet thunder. Dignity is not given, it is reclaimed. It began with a pen stroke. President Ibrahim Traore stood alone in a sunlit office. Before him lay Executive Order 0428, 8 pages long, stamped and ready for his signature. It called for the immediate suspension of all foreign mineral exports pending full legal and environmental review. He signed. Within minutes, alerts went out across the nation. Customs checkpoints were instructed to seize all outbound shipments of gold, manganese, bauxite, and zinc. Mining helicopters were grounded. Military units secured warehouses. Ports halted all outbound cargo under foreign company names. The order was swift, surgical. At the northern border, soldiers stopped the first truck, its crates stamped with an NGO logo, claiming to carry medical supplies. Inside, raw gold bars, hidden beneath bags of rice. The driver was arrested. The border was shut. Within 24 hours, over 70 trucks were halted across the country. Helicopters sat idle on dust-choked helipads. Executives in Europe began making frantic phone calls. Stock prices for mining companies plummeted. Analysts called it a temporary disruption. But they were wrong. This wasn't a tactic, it was a stand. At the presidential compound, Captain Umar Diarra monitored field reports. On a wall-sized map, he marked convoy routes, smuggling zones, known airstrips. They're scrambling, he said. We've got them blind. Judge Aminata Coulibaly sat nearby, pen in hand, drafting legal notices for international courts. They'll call this illegal. But under the Emergency Anti-Corruption Act, we have authority. Economic advisor Idris Nabayogo entered, holding the latest figures. Do you know how much gold they were going to move this week alone? He paused. $170 million. That's 5 sites, 1 week. No one spoke for a moment. Then Traoré leaned over the map. Let them feel the silence, he said. The same silence we lived through while they drained us dry and called it partnership. The state broadcaster ran non-stop coverage. Headlines read, "Foreign mining frozen. President orders full national audit." Footage showed trucks being turned around at borders, soldiers guarding cargo depots, and something rare, smiles on the faces of local miners, as if for the first time someone had said, "I see you." But the most harrowing discovery was still to come. Just beyond the village of Darka, where the map went blank, Captain Umar followed a tip from a former border guard. The man had whispered, "They're not just smuggling gold, they're moving children." Umar moved fast. He and a plainclothes unit reached a walled compound marked Center for the Protection of Children, registered under a European charity. On paper, spotless. Online, impressive. In reality, empty beds, dusty toys, and crates filled not with aid, but with refined gold dust. A list of first names, ages, 6, 7, 8, no last names, no birth dates. They were never meant to exist. In a collapsed shed behind the camp, Umar knelt in the dirt. A notebook lay open, stick figure drawings, and a scrawled sentence. "If I find more gold, they'll bring my sister back." He clenched his jaw. "This isn't about minerals anymore," he whispered. "This is about saving lives." He returned to the capital with photos, evidence, and a renewed fire. Traoré didn't hesitate. That evening, state television aired the images. The crates, the empty beds, the names. There was no need for narration. The nation erupted. Women gathered in public squares. Men volunteered to stand guard at border posts. Teachers canceled classes to hold forums on child labor. Elders, once skeptical, now stood and declared, They've gone too far. The next day, Traoré revoked all foreign charity licenses pending investigation. Surprise inspections began across mining zones. Judge Aminata launched a new department to investigate crimes against minors. In Darka, 3 children were found hiding in a nearby field. One boy, too thin to stand, still clutched a rock in his hand. "If I find the right stone," he said, "they'll bring her back." Captain Umar carried him in silence. Meanwhile, the international community scrambled. At the United Nations, African delegates called for emergency investigation into resource-based child exploitation. In Geneva, a woman named Fatou Doumbia, longtime financial officer for Veritas Extraction, finally broke her silence. She handed Judge Aminata a flash drive, 30 years of transfers, shell companies, laundering schemes, everything. When asked why she came forward, she said only, "He made me rich, but they made me proud." Soon after, Interpol issued a quiet arrest order for Lucien Maro, CEO of Veritas. He was stopped at Geneva International Airport. No shouting, no drama, just a quiet phrase from an officer. "You're not going to court, Mr. Maro. You're going to history." In Ouagadougou, the capital, there were no fireworks, only silence. People stood in small groups. Candles flickered. A woman held up a photo of her son, lost in a collapsed mine shaft. Another raised her daughter's schoolbook, whispering, "She will return to class now." At the National University, students painted a mural on one side, a red beret, on the other, an empty suit. One word beneath it, owned. But the true verdict came from the villages. In Saponet, where it all began, the elders built a wooden stage in the square. Children reenacted what they called the people's trial. No judge, no jury, just truth. They read aloud crimes, poisoned rivers, lost fathers, burned trees. Then they called up Aicha Dembele. She stepped forward slowly, scarves wrapped tight, her hands folded in front. "We taught them math," she said, "and they used it to count what they stole. We taught them language, and they used it to silence us. But now we count ourselves. Now we write our names." The children raised their hands. "We declare the land guilty of silence. But we declare the people innocent and rising." Applause spread not loud but deep. Justice had not come with weapons. It came with memory, with names spoken aloud, with a yellow folder, and a teacher who refused to forget. In Washington, the headlines were troubling and inconvenient. Burkina Faso nationalizes mining contracts. President Traore halts $50 billion in foreign exports. Child trafficking tied to Western charities. In the corridors of power, the language changed. Just days earlier, U.S. officials had viewed Burkina Faso as another fragile African state, manageable, persuadable. But now, a different reality was setting in. A small, landlocked nation had just stood up to the West, and it wasn't blinking. Privately, State Department aides debated, should the U.S. pressure Traore or back off and let the storm pass? Some pushed for quiet diplomacy, economic support in exchange for stability. Others worried about the optics. If we're seen defending these companies, we'll look like the bad guys. The moral cost was suddenly too high to ignore. Meanwhile, across Europe, financial institutions froze. A summit in Brussels nearly collapsed after leaked footage showed gold-labeled aid trucks crossing borders. The threat of sanctions loomed, but so did backlash. One French diplomat admitted off-record, "We called them corrupt, but they read the law better than us." At the United Nations, African voices grew louder, not militant, not radical, just resolute. "We don't reject trade," one delegate said. "We reject theft." Burkina Faso hadn't isolated itself. It had exposed a system and forced the world to look at it. In that moment, the West faced a hard question. Do we punish a nation for reclaiming its dignity, or do we finally listen? In the quiet hills of Saponet, a stone now stands in the village square. No gold, no bronze, just one sentence carved into its face. "We are the soil, and the soil remembers." It is not a monument to victory, but to return, a reminder that justice does not always come with noise, but sometimes with a folded letter, a woman who refused to look away, and a president who chose the hard road over the convenient one. What Burkina Faso has done is more than cancel a contract. It has redefined what sovereignty can mean in a world where power often hides behind paperwork. But this story isn't just about Africa, it's about all of us. It asks us, do we believe dignity should depend on wealth? Do we believe silence means consent or that silence must be broken? Do you think that President Ibrahim Traore's national reform strategies are truly effective yet, or is there still more to be done? If you feel this story stirred something inside you, hope, memory, belief, don't let it pass. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traore. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes the quietest voices carry the most truth.